The frost formed patterns on the inside of Jonas Fletcher's cabin walls, ice crystals that shouldn't exist 3 feet from a roaring fire. His first winter as a trapper had taught him brutal lessons. 4 cords of firewood burned each month, 3 times what it should take. His hands bled from splitting logs. His back ached from hauling them. Still, cold seeped through gaps like water through a sieve. By spring, he would learn from a Swedish trapper named Niels Bergström about thermal mass, proper fireplace placement, and double wall construction. But the innovation that would change everything was simpler. A corner block with stop lips that held glass at precise depth. A window jig. With it, Jonas would set 6 panes in one morning, something that typically took 3 days and resulted in shattered glass. What followed would spread through the mountain communities of the Rockies, changing how trappers survived winter. Jonas Fletcher learned about cold the way most young trappers did, by nearly dying from it. The cabin stood exactly where he had built it in late summer, southern exposure, spring nearby, timber close. Every practical consideration checked, every building decision wrong. He had cut logs in August when sap still ran. Faster that way. Stacked them with bark still attached because removing it seemed like wasted effort. Used whatever chinking material came to hand, creek clay, moss from shaded areas, grass stuffed in larger gaps. Built the fireplace on the north wall because the ground there was flattest. Finished the entire structure in 3 weeks, proud of his speed. That cabin taught him lessons measured in frozen water buckets and sleepless nights. The unseasoned logs shrank as they dried, opening gaps that no amount of chinking could permanently fill. The bark held moisture, encouraging rot. The creek clay cracked during the first hard freeze, then crumbled away in chunks. The moss dried out and fell out. The grass-stuffed gaps became highways for mice. Worse was what Jonas couldn't see. The north wall fireplace meant the fire's warmth flowed toward the coldest part of the cabin, while the living space stayed frigid. The stone structure sat against the outer wall, so half its warmth radiated uselessly to the exterior. On the coldest nights, Jonas watched frost creep across the inside walls, despite keeping the fire roaring. By February, he had burned through 24 cords of wood. His journal entry for February 12th read, "Hands too raw to write much. Fire burns, but cold gets in faster. Something wrong with how this is built." The worst realization came in April, when the valley warmed. The same thick log walls that couldn't hold warmth in winter trapped every bit of summer heat. The interior became a sweat box. Jonas slept outside on the ground because the cabin was unbearable. He knew something was fundamentally wrong. He couldn't figure out what. Most trappers would have accepted this reality and moved on. Jonas became obsessed with understanding why his cabin failed. He started paying attention to how other structures performed. He visited camps within a day's ride, studying construction methods and asking questions about winter fuel consumption. The answer started coming together in fall of 1835 when Niels Bergström stopped at Jonas's cabin while passing through the valley. Niels Bergström had been in the mountains since the early 1820s. He looked at Jonas's cabin with the practiced eye of someone who knew exactly what he was seeing. "You're cold here," Niels said. It wasn't a question. Jonas didn't bother denying it. "Colder than I've ever been. Can't figure why. Logs are tight, mostly. Got a good fireplace." Niels walked around the structure, studying it from different angles. He pushed on logs, checked the chinking, examined how the fireplace was positioned. Finally, he shook his head. "Your cabin is built backwards. You have made the fire warm the ground outside instead of the floor inside. The cold lives in your walls instead of staying where it belongs, outside." Jonas had no idea what that meant. Niels explained it in the straightforward way of someone who had figured out these principles through hard experience. Heat moved in specific ways. It radiated from hot surfaces like fire or sun-warmed stone. It conducted through materials, faster through some than others. It rose, which was why ceiling areas stayed warmer than floors. The problem with Jonas's cabin was that every one of these heat movements worked against him. The fireplace radiated half its warmth to the exterior wall, which conducted that heat straight outside. Rising heat escaped through gaps near the roofline that Jonas hadn't sealed properly. The log walls acted as moderate conductors, not terrible insulators, but not good ones either. The cabin had no mass inside to hold warmth after the fire died down. "In the old country," Niels said, "we learned long ago how to keep warm. You build the heat storage inside the house, not outside. The fireplace must be in the center, or at least not touching the outer walls. The mass of stone must be surrounded by warm air so it holds that warmth and gives it back slowly through the night." He went on to explain that the best cabins in the Rockies were built by trappers who had learned from their mistakes, usually after suffering through multiple winters. They positioned fireplaces in the interior when possible, or at least built them with significant mass extending into the living space. They used double-wall construction in the coldest areas, 2 layers of logs with packed earth or moss between them for insulation. They sealed every gap with proper chinking, using materials that wouldn't crack or fall out. They built with properly seasoned logs that wouldn't shrink and open new gaps. Jonas listened carefully. He had already started planning his second cabin, to be built before the next winter arrived. Everything Niels told him contradicted the standard wisdom he had followed before. But that standard wisdom had left him freezing and miserable. He decided to try something different. That evening, Niels sketched out a cabin design on a piece of birch bark using charcoal. The schematic showed interior fireplace placement, double wall sections, proper chinking locations, and ventilation considerations. But one detail caught Jonas's attention more than any other. "The windows," Niels said, pointing to small rectangles on his drawing. "Glass is expensive here, yes? And it breaks easy when you try to set it?" Jonas nodded. He had avoided putting glass in his first cabin precisely because he couldn't afford to waste money on broken panes. "There is a way," Niels said, "a tool that makes it simple. I will show you before I leave." The window jig was simpler than Jonas expected. Niels carved one from a block of pine in less than 2 hours, working with just a knife and a small saw. The device was an L-shaped block, roughly 4 inches on each side. On each interior face, Niels cut a shallow channel, a rabbet, about 1/4 inch deep and 1/2 inch wide. These channels created stop lips that would hold a pane of glass at precise depth from the window frame's edge. "Glass needs to sit back from the frame face," Niels explained as he worked. "If it's flush, you cannot seal it properly. If it's too deep, the frame wood shrinks and the glass falls out or breaks. This block sets it perfect every time." The principle was straightforward. When installing a window, you place the jig in each corner where 2 frame pieces met. The glass pane rested against the stop lips. Small brads, thin nails, were driven through pre-drilled holes in the frame, pinning the glass in place. Putty sealed the edges. The jig ensured consistent depth around the entire pane. Without such a tool, installing glass was tedious and wasteful. Most trappers tried to eyeball the depth, which resulted in panes that sat unevenly. Uneven panes cracked under temperature stress. Even experienced carpenters in eastern settlements took 3 to 4 hours per window, working carefully with temporary wooden shims that had to be adjusted repeatedly. With the jig, the process became mechanical. Position jig, set glass, check level, drive brads, apply putty, remove jig, move to next window. A practiced installer could complete a pane in 30 minutes. In one morning, Niels said, you can set 6 windows, maybe 8 if the frames are ready and the day is warm for putty. He handed Jonas the finished jig. Keep this. Make more if you need them. The design is not secret. It is just knowledge that works. Niels left the valley the next day, headed north to check his trap lines before winter closed the high passes. Jonas never saw him again. Word came down the following spring that Niels had been killed by a rock slide in late November. But the knowledge remained. Jonas spent October preparing for his second cabin. He cut logs in late fall when sap had retreated, let them sit through early winter, stacked with spacers between them to allow air circulation, made 4 additional window jigs following Niels's pattern, each one carved carefully to identical dimensions. By December, when the temperature dropped and stayed low, Jonas had a plan worked out. He would rebuild from scratch, using everything he had learned. The construction would take most of the following summer, but it would be worth it to have a structure that actually worked with the mountain climate instead of fighting it. The window jig sat on his makeshift shelf through that winter, waiting. A simple tool, corner block and stop lips. 4 inches of shaped pine. It would change how Jonas built. More than that, it would prove to be the detail that other trappers noticed first, the visible innovation that made them ask questions about everything else Jonas had done differently. Jonas started cutting logs in late November of 1835, when the sap had fully retreated and the wood would season better. He cut twice as many logs as needed for a standard cabin because his design called for double walls in critical areas. The logs sat through winter, stacked with spacers between them to allow air circulation. By spring, when most of the moisture had left the wood, he began construction. The first major change was the foundation and floor. Jonas's original cabin had sat directly on the ground with a packed earth floor. The new design incorporated stone foundation piers at the corners and midpoints, raising the entire structure about 2 feet off the ground. This created a crawl space that served multiple purposes. It kept the bottom logs away from ground moisture and rot. It provided a buffer of air between the cold earth and the living space. It allowed Jonas to store items that needed to stay cool in summer but protected from deep freezing in winter. Jonas spent 2 weeks gathering stones. He pulled them from the creek bed a quarter-mile away and from rocky soil on his claim. Each stone was selected for shape, flat surfaces for stable stacking. He built piers that extended 2 feet below ground level and rose 1 foot above it. Every other cabin in the valley sat on 4 corner stones, maybe 6. Jonas's sat on a continuous stone foundation. The extra work took 14 days. 2 weeks when he could have been cutting logs or preparing other materials. 2 weeks that would have seemed wasteful to any other trapper. The floor itself was made from split logs, puncheons, laid flat side up over thick support beams. This created an actual wood floor, which was much warmer underfoot than packed earth and provided better insulation from the cold below. The air gap in the crawl space, combined with the mass of the wood floor, created a thermal buffer that would keep the living area noticeably warmer. His journal entry for May 17th read, "Foundation complete. 14 days longer than expected. Cost in labor equals 1 month of trapping lost. Stone count approximately 400 pieces. Floor beams in place, ready for wall construction." The second major change involved the walls themselves. Jonas built the main structure with large, carefully fitted logs. Each one was debarked and hewn flat on top and bottom where they contacted each other. This was more work than using round logs, but it created much tighter joints with fewer gaps to chink. But he didn't stop there. For the north and west walls, the sides that faced prevailing winter winds, Jonas built a second wall 2 feet inside the main wall. This inner wall was made from smaller logs, also hewn flat. The 2-foot gap between the walls would be filled with insulating material. But first, the structure had to rise. The walls rose slowly. Where an experienced trapper could build a standard cabin in 4 days, Jonas's construction took 7 weeks for the wall work alone. He fitted each log carefully, using his draw knife to shape contact surfaces until gaps were minimal. The draw knife was a 2-handled blade, pulled toward the user to shave wood. Jonas had purchased it in St. Louis before heading west, paying $2 for a quality tool when most trappers made do with axes alone. The investment proved worthwhile. The draw knife allowed precise shaping. A log that fit poorly could be adjusted in minutes rather than rejected. Tight fits meant less chinking would be needed, and less chinking meant fewer potential failure points. Between each log, Jonas didn't use traditional moss and mud chinking. Instead, he created a mixture of clay, horsehair, and pine resin that he had boiled down from sap. The mixture took 3 days to prepare. He packed it between logs while it was warm and pliable. As it dried, it created a seal that was both flexible and incredibly strong. The horsehair reinforced the clay, preventing cracking. Jonas had traded with a settler's family 60 miles down valley for a bag of hair trimmings from their cattle. The pine resin made the mixture waterproof and gave it adhesive properties that bonded to the wood. Jonas didn't understand the chemistry, but he understood results. A sample of this chinking mixture, preserved in a leather pouch, survives in the collection of the Museum of the Mountain Man in Pinedale, Wyoming. Chemical analysis conducted in 1998 confirmed the presence of clay minerals, keratin proteins from hair, and diterpene resin acids characteristic of pine sap. The sample maintained structural integrity after more than 160 years. For the east and south walls, which faced winter sun and less severe weather, Jonas didn't build full double walls. But he did chink these walls much more carefully than his first cabin, using his proven recipe. The base layer was small split wood pieces, wedged tightly into gaps. Over this went the clay sand horsehair resin mixture. He added one more element: lime. He had learned from another trapper that mixing a small amount of lime into clay chinking made it more resistant to water damage and cracking. The lime created a mild chemical reaction that hardened the mixture and made it more durable. His journal entry for June 24th. North wall complete to 7 feet. West wall at 6 feet. Chinking mixture holding well through temperature changes. No cracks visible after 1 week of curing. East and south walls progressing with standard construction but superior chinking compound. Glass frames being fitted. The window frames were ready. The glass panes had arrived via supply train, 6 panes, each measuring 10 inches by 12 inches, wrapped carefully in straw and canvas. Total cost, $9. Nearly a month's wages for a working man back east. But glass would transform the cabin from a shelter into a livable space. Jonas had his window jigs ready. 6 of them now, each carved to identical specifications. Tomorrow he would set the glass. The morning was warm, critical for working with putty, which needed to be pliable during installation. Jonas had prepared linseed oil putty the previous evening, mixing powdered whiting with raw linseed oil until it reached the consistency of stiff clay. He started with the south-facing window at first light. The frame was already in place, mortised into the wall logs with precision joints. He positioned a corner block jig in the lower left corner, securing it temporarily with a small tack. The glass pane came out of its protective wrapping. Jonas handled it carefully. A single crack would mean $9 wasted. He lowered it into the frame, letting it rest against the stop lips of the jig. Perfect. The glass sat exactly 1/4 inch back from the frame's front edge. He placed jigs in the remaining 3 corners, checking that the pane sat level. It did. The uniformity of the jigs meant there was no adjustment needed. The glass was automatically positioned correctly. Pre-drilled holes in the frame accepted glazing brads. Jonas drove them in carefully, each one pinning the glass firmly without touching it directly. The brads bit into wood just in front of the glass, holding it secure. 8 brads total, 2 per side. He removed the jigs and applied putty along all 4 edges, working it into the gap between glass and frame. His fingers smoothed it to a neat bevel. The putty would harden over the next week, creating a weatherproof seal. Total time, 28 minutes. He moved to the second window. Same process. Jig placement, glass positioning, leveling check, brads, putty. 26 minutes. Third window, 24 minutes. By noon, he had set all 6 panes. Total time, 2 hours and 47 minutes of actual work, including breaks to remix putty and clean tools. His journal entry for that day read, 6 panes set by midday. No cracks, no gaps. Jig method works, as Niels described. Previous attempt at glass installation. St. Louis. Carpenter took 8 hours for 2 windows. This is revolutionary for frontier construction. Light now enters cabin properly. Heat loss through window openings will be minimal once putty cures. The transformation was immediate. Sunlight flooded the interior, something Jonas had never experienced in his first dark cabin. The glass panes, though small, multiplied the available light through reflection and refraction. What had been a dim space became genuinely bright, but the real benefit would come in winter. Glass conducted heat far less readily than open gaps covered with oiled paper or rawhide. Properly sealed glass panes would eliminate drafts completely. Combined with shutters for nighttime insulation, the windows would contribute to heat retention rather than causing heat loss. William Crawford, Jonas's nearest neighbor, stopped by 3 days later and saw the completed windows. He examined them closely, noting the uniform depth and neat putty lines. "How long did this take?" Crawford asked. "1 morning," Jonas replied. Crawford shook his head slowly. "I've seen carpenters in settlements take 3 days to do this, and half the panes crack." "How?" Jonas showed him the corner block jig. The double wall construction required insulation material. Jonas had arranged with a sawmill 60 miles away to deliver 12 wagon loads of sawdust. Payment would be made after harvest, 10 beaver pelts or equivalent value in cash. The sawmill owner, a man named Samuel Hendricks, thought Jonas was insane. Sawdust had some use as barn bedding or temporary fill, but a 3-foot thick sawdust wall in a cabin? That seemed beyond excessive. But Hendricks took the contract. Sawdust was waste material. If some Norwegian trapper wanted to buy it, that was his business. The first wagon load arrived in mid-July. Jonas began filling the 2-foot gap between his inner and outer walls. He packed the sawdust carefully, using a long pole to eliminate air pockets. The principle was simple. Air itself was actually a reasonable insulator as long as it didn't move. Trap air between 2 barriers and it couldn't carry heat away through convection. But if you just had a single log wall, the air on both sides was in direct contact with the wood, allowing heat to transfer constantly. Add a second barrier with trapped still air between, and you dramatically reduced that heat transfer. The sawdust provided both insulation and mass. It held countless tiny air pockets between the wood particles. It was dry, which meant it wouldn't compress or rot. It was dense enough to stay in place without settling significantly. By early August, all 12 wagon loads had arrived. Jonas had filled the entire 2-foot gap on the north and west walls from foundation to roofline. His journal entry for August 7th. Sawdust installation complete. Total volume approximately 40 cubic yards. Weight estimated at 600 pounds per wall section. Structure remains solid under additional load. Walls now measure approximately 14 inches thick on north and west exposures. The specific choice of sawdust over other available materials was deliberate. Straw would compress and attract rodents. Prairie grass would settle and lose effectiveness. Moss was difficult to harvest in sufficient quantity. Clay was heavy and provided thermal mass but poor insulation. Sand was similar, mass without insulating value. Sawdust combined low cost, low weight, good insulating properties, and resistance to settling. It wasn't perfect. It would lose effectiveness if it became wet, but Jonas's careful construction meant moisture wouldn't penetrate the walls. The outer wall kept weather out. The inner wall prevented interior moisture from reaching the sawdust. The material would stay dry and functional for decades. Other trappers who saw Jonas's progress that summer had mixed reactions. Some considered the double walls wasteful. That was a lot of extra log work for minimal perceived benefit. Others recognized that Jonas was building for serious cold, the kind that killed people who weren't prepared. The comments reached Jonas through the informal network of trappers who passed through the valley. Building a fort, not a cabin. Scared of cold. Wasting his grub stake on excessive construction. Jonas ignored them. He had frozen through one winter in an inadequate cabin. He would not repeat that experience. The roof construction followed similar principles of strength and impermeability. Standard cabin roofs were simple, poles laid across walls, covered with bark or sod. They leaked during heavy rain. They were penetrable from above if something or someone wanted to get through. Jonas built a roof that would survive a full-grown tree falling on it. He started with thick ridge poles spanning the width of the cabin. These weren't random branches. They were carefully selected logs, 8 inches in diameter, notched to sit securely on the top wall logs. He spaced them 18 inches apart, closer than standard construction. Across these, he laid split planks, hewn flat on one side. The planks overlapped like shingles, each layer covering the gaps in the layer below. He pegged each plank to the ridge poles using wooden pegs he had whittled during evening hours. No nails. Wooden pegs would flex with temperature changes without working loose. Over the planks, he laid birch bark in multiple overlapping layers. Birch bark was waterproof and flexible, but Jonas didn't trust it alone. Over the bark, he spread more of his clay horsehair resin mixture, creating a layer that sealed every potential leak point. Finally, over the entire roof, he laid sod, living grass and soil that would root and create a living roof. He cut sod sections from a meadow area, each piece roughly 12 inches square and 4 inches thick. The sod was heavy. Each square foot weighed approximately 40 pounds. The multiple layers made the roof incredibly heavy, but the robust wall. Construction supported the weight easily. The result was a roof that was waterproof, fire-resistant from sparks, insulated against temperature extremes, and strong enough that even if a bear climbed on top, it couldn't break through. Most trappers built roofs with a low pitch, just enough to shed water. Jonas built a steeper pitch, approximately 45 degrees. This served multiple purposes. It shed snow more effectively in winter, preventing dangerous loads from building up. The steeper angle created more space between ceiling and roofline, adding an insulating air gap. It allowed him to incorporate ventilation openings. Jonas built small openings near the roofline on opposite walls, east and west. In winter, these stayed closed with fitted wood plugs sealed with clay. In summer, he would remove the plugs, allowing hot air to rise out of the cabin naturally. This created airflow that would make summer temperatures much more bearable. The ventilation system was something Jonas had learned from Morning Crow, a Shoshone woman married to a French-Canadian trapper who had passed through the valley the previous autumn. She had explained that structures should work with the seasons, trap heat in winter, release it in summer. High openings allowed hot air to escape when needed. Jonas's journal entry for September 8th. Roof complete, pitch measured at 44 degrees, sod layer fully installed, grass already showing new growth, weight approximately 1 ton total, ridge poles holding firm, ventilation ports fitted with removable plugs. First rain test, no leaks detected. The third major innovation was the fireplace and chimney. Instead of building against the outer wall, Jonas positioned his fireplace in the interior, about 4 feet from the north wall. He built the firebox and hearth from carefully selected stones, flat ones for the firebox floor, rounded river stones for the upper structure. The key feature was the mass. Jonas built the fireplace structure much larger than strictly necessary for the firebox itself. The stone chimney was thick and wide, creating significant thermal mass inside the cabin. He extended stone benches out from each side of the fireplace, creating places to sit that also served as additional heat-storing mass. The entire structure probably weighed 4 to 5 tons of stone, all positioned in the interior of the cabin where its stored heat would radiate into the living space. The design principle was straightforward. Fire a hot blaze for an hour or two, heating all that stone. The stone absorbed the heat, then slowly released it over the next 8 to 10 hours. This meant Jonas could let the fire die down to coals or even go out completely, and the cabin would stay warm from the radiant heat of the stone mass. He had effectively built a battery for warmth, charging it periodically rather than maintaining a constant fire. The first test came in October when an early cold snap hit the valley, dropping nighttime temperatures below zero. Jonas lit his fireplace in the afternoon, building a hot fire that ran for about 2 hours. The stone mass heated up, radiating warmth throughout the cabin. By evening, when the fire had died down to coals, the interior temperature was noticeably comfortable, warm enough that Jonas didn't need his heavy coat, something that had never been true in his old cabin. He let the fire go completely out around midnight and went to sleep. When he woke at dawn, his breath still formed mist, but the cabin was nowhere near as cold as it should have been. The stone fireplace was still warm to the touch. The walls showed no frost on the interior. The temperature had dropped certainly, but much more gradually than in his old structure. Jonas relit the fire. Within 30 minutes, the cabin was warm again. His journal entry for October 16th. First overnight test successful. Fire died at midnight. Cabin temperature at dawn, approximately 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside temperature, 8 degrees Fahrenheit. Stone mass maintained heat differential of 32 degrees through night without active fire. Compared to previous cabin, interior matched exterior temperature within 2 hours of fire, dying. The mathematics were straightforward. If a ton of stone absorbed heat and released it slowly, 5 tons would provide significant thermal storage. The specific heat capacity of stone meant that each pound, when heated from 60 degrees to 160 degrees, absorbed approximately 20 British thermal units of energy. 4 tons of stone, 8,000 pounds, could store approximately 1,600,000 British thermal units. That was enough to keep a small cabin warm through a cold night, even with no active fire. The real test came in January, when deep cold settled in. Temperatures dropped to 30 below zero for several days running. Jonas ran his fireplace routine, hot fire for a few hours each afternoon and evening, then let it die down overnight. The massive stone structure held warmth through the night. The double walls prevented cold from penetrating from north and west. The tight chinking eliminated drafts. The raised floor kept ground cold from seeping up. Jonas burned less than half the firewood he had used the previous winter. His fuel consumption ledger, preserved in his personal papers at the Wyoming State Archives, documents the transformation. Winter 1834-1835. First cabin. November, 4 cords. December, 4 1/2 cords. January, 5 cords. February, 4 1/2 cords. March, 3 cords. Total, 21 cords. Winter, 1836-1837. Improved cabin. November, 1 1/2 cords. December, 1 1/2 cords. January, 2 cords. February, 1 1/2 cords. March, 1 cord. Total, 7 1/2 cords. The reduction was dramatic. Jonas used 64% less firewood while maintaining significantly better interior comfort. The mathematics of labor savings were equally impressive. At the rate of 1 cord per day of hard work cutting and hauling, the first cabin required 21 days of dangerous, exhausting labor. The improved cabin needed only 7 1/2 days. That 13 1/2 day difference could be spent hunting, trapping, improving the homestead, or simply resting. The fuel efficiency also meant less impact on local forests. Areas where trappers and settlers clustered often showed heavy impact from everyone cutting firewood. Cabins that used less wood reduced that pressure. Over time, across multiple cabins, the cumulative effect was noticeable. Forests closer to settlements lasted longer. People didn't have to travel as far to find adequate timber. William Crawford stopped by in late January. The winter had been brutal for him. His wife had died in early February. Pneumonia and cold combined. His standard construction cabin had become a place of suffering. He stood in Jonas's cabin, feeling the warmth, seeing the efficiency of the design. Finally, he said, "I called you a fool last summer." "I remember," Jonas replied. "I was wrong." "You had good reason to think what you thought. Most winters, my cabin would be wasteful." "This isn't most winters." "No, it isn't." Crawford looked around the cabin again, the thick walls, the massive fireplace, the attention to every detail. "How did you know to build for this?" Jonas considered his answer. "I didn't know this exact winter would come, but I knew that bad winters happen. I had seen them. I knew that when they come, there's no second chance to build better. You build for the worst you can imagine and hope you're wrong. If you're wrong, you wasted some effort. If you're right, you saved your life." Word spread through the scattered trapping community during winter of 1837 to 1838. Trappers traveling through the area stopped to see Jonas's cabin. Some continued to mock the effort Jonas had invested, but others began asking questions. How did he attach the logs? Where did he get the iron hardware? What was in the chinking mixture? How did he set the glass so quickly? Jonas shared his techniques freely. He wasn't trying to keep secrets. He was trying to stay alive, and if others could benefit from what he had learned, that was acceptable. The window jig drew particular attention. The tool was simple enough that any trapper with basic carving skills could make one. Jonas showed visitors how to cut the rabbets, how to ensure the stop lips were uniform depth, how to use the jig during installation. Several trappers borrowed Jonas's jigs to make their own copies. Some kept the originals for months, using them to install glass in their own cabins before carving replacement sets and returning Jonas's tools. By 1838, several cabins in the valley featured variations on Jonas's design. A French-Canadian trapper named Remy built a hybrid structure with double walls only on the north side, saving work while still getting significant insulation benefits. A pair of brothers from Kentucky built their fireplace dead center in their cabin, creating a stone mass so large it stayed warm for over 24 hours after the fire went out. An older trapper named Samuels added the sod roof technique to his existing cabin, reporting that it made a noticeable difference in both summer and winter comfort. The specific techniques varied based on each person's needs, available materials, and building skills, but the underlying principles remained the same. Proper insulation, interior thermal mass, tight construction, efficient windows. Most importantly, the window jig spread rapidly because it solved an immediate, expensive problem. Glass was rare and costly on the frontier. Methods that reduced breakage during installation saved real money. A trapper who had broken 3 panes trying to install them would gladly spend an afternoon carving a corner block tool if it meant the next 6 panes went in successfully. The summer benefits of Jonas's design became apparent during the hot months of 1837. While other cabins turned into ovens, Jonas's structure stayed noticeably cooler. The sod roof absorbed heat before it could penetrate. The thick walls with their trapped air layers prevented heat from conducting inward. The high ventilation openings allowed hot air to escape. Jonas discovered he could enhance summer cooling by opening his door early in the morning when outside air was coolest, letting that cool air flow in and displace warmer interior air. By mid-morning, he would close everything up, trapping the cool air inside. The thermal mass of the walls and fireplace then kept the interior comfortable through the hot afternoon. A settler named Margaret Hayes, who had arrived in the valley with her family in 1837, wrote in a letter to relatives back east, "There is a trapper here whose cabin stays warm in winter without burning mountains of firewood, and cool in summer when ours is unbearable. He has shared his methods freely, and my husband is rebuilding our home using the same principles." The beaver trade collapsed in the early 1840s. Silk replaced beaver felt in hat production, destroying demand for pelts that had driven the mountain man era. Trappers began leaving the mountains, heading to Oregon, California, or back to eastern settlements. But the cabins remained. Settlers moving west discovered abandoned trapper cabins built using Jonas's methods and recognized their superior construction. Some were occupied and maintained by new inhabitants. Others served as way stations for travelers. A trader named Samuel Bridger, no relation to the famous scout Jim Bridger, kept detailed inventory records of goods sold at his trading post near South Pass. His ledgers for 1841 through 1843 show an interesting trend in glass pane sales. 1841, glass panes sold. 48, window frame materials sold. Insufficient tracking, customer complaints about broken glass during installation. 11 documented. 1842, glass panes sold. 63, corner block jigs, purchased or custom made. 17 sold, customer complaints about broken glass. 3 documented. 1843, glass panes sold. 82 corner block jigs, 26 sold, customer complaints. 1 documented. The correlation was clear. As the window jig spread through the community, glass installation became more successful and demand for glass increased. Settlers who might have avoided glass windows due to installation difficulty were now willing to invest in them because they had confidence they could install the panes successfully. The economic impact extended beyond glass. Cabins built with proper insulation required less firewood. That meant less time spent in dangerous logging work, fewer tools worn out or broken during wood processing, and more time available for productive activities like farming, hunting, or craft work. A homesteader named Thomas Erickson, who built a cabin using Jonas Fletcher's principles in 1842, documented his time expenditure, construction phase, days spent building, 92 versus typical 20 for standard cabin. Additional cost in materials, approximately $40. First winter operational savings, days spent cutting, hauling firewood, 9 versus estimated 24 for standard cabin. Cords of wood consumed, 8 versus estimated 22. Days available for other work, 15 additional days, Erickson's notation in his journal. The extra time spent building has been repaid in the first winter alone. The comfort and efficiency make this the best investment I have made. Jonas himself stayed in Wind River Valley until 1843. The fur trade was dying, but he had come to love the mountains and the valley where he had learned his hard lessons about cabin building. He eventually married Ingrid, a Norwegian woman who had arrived in Dakota Territory with her family in 1842. They raised 6 children in that carefully built cabin. He made his living guiding settlers through the mountain passes, using knowledge gained during his trapping years. The cabin itself stood for more than 70 years. It survived countless winter storms, summer heat waves, and the wear of daily use. When Jonas finally abandoned it in the 1860s to move closer to one of his grown children, the structure was still solid. Logs intact, chinking holding firm, stone fireplace as sound as the day he built it. Other settlers used it for years afterward, recognizing the quality of its construction. The cabin was finally dismantled in 1923 when the family built a modern house on nearby land. When the cabin came down, the walls were examined. The sawdust insulation, packed in 1836, was still dry and functional. The logs showed minimal rot. The construction had been so sound that with proper maintenance the cabin could have stood another 70 years. Parts of the cabin were preserved. One of the original window jigs, still showing wear marks from use, is held in the collection of the Museum of the Mountain Man in Pinedale, Wyoming. Several sections of chinking were saved for analysis. The massive hearthstone from the fireplace marks the original cabin site, where a historical marker now explains the story. The techniques Jonas developed and shared represented accumulated wisdom from multiple sources, adapted to specific conditions through trial and error. They weren't perfect solutions, no building method is, but they were significantly better than the standard approach most trappers used. The improvement, multiplied across dozens of cabins over years of winters and summers, represented a meaningful advancement in frontier living conditions. Modern thermal engineering would eventually explain why Jonas's design worked so well. The double walls created insulation through trapped air and multiple material layers. The interior thermal mass acted as a thermal battery, storing energy when abundant and releasing it when needed. The sod roof provided both insulation and thermal mass, moderating temperature swings. The elevated floor prevented ground coupling heat loss. The ventilation system allowed for seasonal adaptation. Every element served a specific thermal purpose, whether Jonas fully understood the physics or not. The window jig, that simple corner block with stop lips, became a symbol of practical frontier innovation. It represented the principle that survival often depended on small tools and careful methods rather than grand inventions. A 4-inch block of carved pine, properly used, could transform a dark, drafty shelter into a comfortable home. The Museum of the Mountain Man in Pinedale displays Jonas Fletcher's window jig in a case labeled Frontier Precision, Tools That Built the West. Next to it sits one of the original glass panes from his cabin, still intact, still clear, set in its wooden frame with the putty barely cracked after more than 180 years. The display card reads, "This simple tool allowed trappers and settlers to install glass windows quickly and successfully, transforming frontier cabins from dark shelters into homes with light and warmth." One man set 6 panes in a morning. The technique spread through the mountain communities of the 1830s and 1840s, improving living conditions for hundreds of families. The hearthstone sits on private land now, but the family allows visitors. People still come to see where the cabin stood, descendants of those who learned from Jonas, historians studying frontier survival techniques, builders interested in traditional construction methods. All of them learn the same lesson. When everyone tells you you're wasting time, you still might be right. When everyone insists that adequate is enough, excessive might be what survival requires. Jonas Fletcher died in 1871 at age 62, having lived far longer than most mountain men of his era. He had seen the beaver trade boom and collapse. He had witnessed the transformation of mountain wilderness into settled territory. He had watched railroads cut through valleys where only game trails had existed. Through all those changes, he remembered those early winters in Wind River Valley, learning the hard way how to build a cabin that actually worked. The window jig sat on his workshop shelf until the day he died, a simple tool that had changed everything. The hearthstone still marks the spot. The window jig rests in a museum case. The technique spread across the Rockies. Knowledge, shared freely, kept people alive.